Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Value of Everything. Okay, so just a little thought popped into my head the other day, and we have a lot of decades which always bring to mind certain eras, certain senses of time, certain memorable moments, especially music, movies to a degree as well, states of the economy. I guess that's a determining factor as well. But I don't know why, but it seems to me, now this could be a couple of things which are coming to mind here. We either have an issue with so the main point I'm getting at here is past 2000 we don't seem to have much of a definition of what it is. I can't describe it. I don't think there's really any sort of certain dress code. I don't think there's anything that's really standing out. There could be a couple of things, but I'll try and point them out as I can. But as we look past at all the other decades, there seems to be a lot more definition which has occurred, and past 2000 there hasn't been much at all. And I've got a few theories which are going on in my head about this. Now, firstly, it could be just like the old man saying, well, it's not as good as the old days. There was definitely like things are happening in the old days, whereas nowadays you can't really define decades. But yeah, interesting points as well. And also, for some reason, I don't even think that we can sort of declare that from 2000 to 2010 has really been a defining decade, and there's been really any sort of change between 2000 to 2015, which is interesting. So I'll explore a few of those factors and thoughts as well. So I guess we can look at history books with regards to really before the 1900s sort of eras, and it's a little bit tricky just to sort of describe and define things. I know maybe you might have like the era of the Victorian age and the Industrial Revolution, and there was I know from a British perspective there's like the stiff upper lip and people being maybe trying to keep a little bit more of a higher standard, virtue, maybe like the Puritan movements, things like that. So we do have a little bit of definition which happens beforehand, but it's just because I think it's so far back in the past. It's a little bit tricky just to determine things, and it hasn't been really portrayed really that much in movies and the media. But as we get into the 1900s or the 20th century, we seem to get something, maybe not from 1900 to 1915, but particularly beyond that point, maybe obviously the Roaring Twenties, we can definitely start to define things at that point. So Roaring Twenties, I guess this may be also a little connection with media here as well. So we're getting the sort of the age of cinema really kicking in at that point, and we do have some kind of portrayal of the 1900s, the Roaring Twenties, stock market booms, a lot of inventions, particularly coming out from America, expansion. This is obviously after the First World War as well, so you had that darkness as a sort of subset, but you do have, and it's interesting how the media will define every decade as well, because from my perspective I think that media and how we sort of point out certain little aspects from decades is interesting, how it defines things. So yeah, we'll have a certain definition from how the media sort of portrays it and how it distincts certain, particularly with how technology improves and it sort of highlights different parts of the era. And it might be there's an interesting coloration. What's the? How the hell can I say the word? Correlation. Correlation. There you go. A correlation between the way that we expand our media and how we go on different formats, from movies to music to internet, and how things are defined from those perspectives. Also, I guess we have to highlight the element of globalization. So remember where I mentioned at first, where I'm saying, like, particularly the Roaring Twenties in America and the Industrial Revolution in Britain. We are a little bit more isolated at that point, because there isn't like mass transit and people aren't getting around that much. As time progresses, there's a lot more things and crossovers where we're connecting on. If you think about toys and stuff like that, which are more of a global phenomenon, especially when so especially when the medium is released around the world. So the first one, which would be the one that gets released around the world in a mass scale, would be your movies, because then you can portray, oh yeah, that's the same movie that I watched as well, because that will get generally worldly released. You wouldn't necessarily get the same publication of a newspaper released globally. You wouldn't get the global news. You'd usually get the country's news. So yeah, interesting points there. So let's just go through a few of the decades, and you may have some extra little thoughts as to my little depiction of these eras. Now, so we have the Roaring Twenties, we have the Depression of the 1930s, then unfortunately the 40s is defined by the Second World War. So let's just quickly go back from the 1930s. So the 1930s, despair. You're thinking of that picture of the photo of that woman with the child. That American picture is like a bit of a defining picture of the Great Depression. You're not really seeing anything fantastical happening around that point. Maybe the Roaring Twenties again. You're thinking about a lot of engineering feats and releases of new equipment and labor-saving devices. But yeah, the 1930s really is like a retraction of ideas and expansion, and really like a definition of just sort of survival, really, and getting through tough times. Now, unfortunately, this is the precursor of the Second World War, so now we have 1940s, and we are defining it with world wars. It's really just in my memory and how I would sort of describe it. Everything's, so I'm born in 1982, so everything's sort of defined in that respect. To me, as just being a war. Black and white TV is obviously remember when you're a kid, you think in the old days everybody was in black and white, but yeah, it's a definition, like it's a defining age where there was war, and that's an interesting thought in the respect that somebody that was born in the 1980s onwards, especially in the Western world, hasn't really sort of experienced mass conscription, wars, and just sees it as some kind of fanciful sort of ideal, which is kind of a danger. Because the reason why it's a little bit of a danger is because of its it doesn't seem that real. So it's like, oh, okay, we're going to go to war. Let's see what happens, sort of thing. Rather than, oh my god, I've been through that. I've had my first oldest son being decimated, and I don't want that to happen to the next, and all those kind of like factors, which is why I guess Britain was a little bit hesitant in getting involved in the Second World War. So yeah, that's the actual definition of the 1940s. It's got to be really. Then we approach the 1950s, and this is just sort of like the explosion of America and its force and its power. You get the, I mean, I could be totally talking my arse, but you got the sort of the ideals where there's a lot of profit that's been taken by America through that Second World War. Obviously, there's a certain amount of hardships, and the retooling of the factories has to go back into consumables again. But yeah, it's an age of expansion. It's the age of empire of America. It is the emergence of America as the global force. It's the age of the age of nuclear as well. It seems to how you get the images of. I know it probably happened in the 1940s, but you seem to define nuclear energy and that sort of age of might from America from the 1950s. You also get the idea of that little bit of that sense of the maybe the nuclear family, I guess. The idea of mum and dad and two parents and two children, and looking after the family, got the house, got the car. There's a sort of the depiction of the ideal life, the white picket fence. People are polite to each other. Now, this is obviously, I'm creating this little bubble here. It's a very optimistic view of the 1950s, and maybe there was a lot of roughness involved. There was ghettos, there was violence, there was definite. Well, this is the defining moment of racism as well, the 1950s. So there's a lot of ugliness which is occurring in that time, but there's also that American dream sort of ideal there, and it's interesting how that's been inserted in my mind, particularly from being like a 1980s guy. Now, this might be a little connection going on here, is certain movies that portray the 1950s as a beautiful time. The obvious one, which will be Back to the Future. But there are many other movies which will depict the 1950s as a wondrous time, and potentially it was a wondrous time. There is a lot of there's supermarkets, there's a number of services, and the real urbanization of America, which is occurring at that point in time, and you do get that good kind of sense. Now, the 1950s for Britain doesn't sound as really as a romantic. It sort of is like the age of where you're getting a lot of left-wing, slightly communist-leaning Labour parties coming into power, putting forth welfare systems. And there's lots of building of estates, ugly estates, and things like that. There's a lot of that from the Britain side, but we're always looking over our shoulders at the Americans and seeing how wondrous they're getting. Obviously, us as the empire has totally been wiped out by 2 world wars, humongous amounts of debt, and all of our factories are union-based, and really we're just getting our teeth kicked in at the end, where we're dead on the floor. Now, I'm talking in a national sense. Obviously, I'm not a big British nationalist, so yeah, it's not really it's the land that we lived in and the society of interests, and obviously being under a certain government. So that takes us to the 1950s. Now, here we go. Now it kicks into the also, yeah, just to depict music, we've got like the Frank Sinatras. We've got sort of can we say gangster music maybe? But it's still very gentle music about love, about romance, about a number of really sort of very light-hearted music, which is occurring here. So it's interesting how that generation is sort of still in the realm. Like, obviously, it's a lot of that generation has seen the highest amounts of despair and awfulness of human nature you could possibly even see. That they've seen literally hell on earth. I'm talking about the men that have gone to war and things like that. So if you can think of it in that respect, yet the music is potentially a counterbalance of that time, just to make us feel, oh, okay, yeah, that's life is good, and we're going to keep that sort of darkness at the back of our minds. I know that there's a lot of veterans that will not talk about the horrors that they've seen and would rather keep themselves in a just a shadow of their lives, of that part of their lives. So next era we get to is the swinging 60s. Now, it's even got a little name to it, which is funny. Now, remember, this is just all things that are just popping out of my head. It's nothing really that's... there could be a lot of people that have experienced the 60s in a totally different way from where I am conjuring up these thoughts. Now, you do get this little sense of, and then this is probably my little British influence, the Carnaby Street, the... you're thinking of... like hippie clothes. You're thinking about people smoking a lot of marijuana and taking hallucinogenics. You are thinking about just the grooviness of Austin Powers, obviously that depiction of the 1960s, the Beatles. You're getting a lot of music and stuff. Let's not forget that Elvis is really crashing. Coming through. I know he came through in the 50s more so than anything else, and he was he burst through in that respect, and that's more so for the generation that didn't really go to war. I would say more so than the generation that did. So it's interesting how there's the counterculture which is kicking in at that point of this wonderful "I'm in Love" stories songs compared to like. A little bit, well, and it's still I'm in love and stuff like that, but there's a little bit more raunchiness about touching hands and stuff like that within the 60s. So you just got to be aware of that. There's the free love movements. There's a very liberal left, peace loving culture which is emerging as well. So and you get the vivid imagery of dots and multicolours and those shirts. Maybe not so much. I'm really twisting a little bit into the 70s here, but yeah, there's that sort of kicking from the 60s. But there's obviously a very sort of mild-manneredness of the 60s. Is nowhere near as full throttle as you get in the later decades, but still it's really just flourishing the can we say liberal movement? I guess a liberal movement, a bit more peace orientated, a little bit more a bit more aware of human rights. There's that sort of movement that is emerging. Economy-wise, everything's going pretty cruisy. I think Britain's slightly starting to re-emerge a little bit, and hey, and yeah, it's going all right. Next up, we kick into the 70s, and now the 70s is interesting. You definitely start thinking about the hippie, the long hair, the dude, the the person who goes around in the Volkswagen camper van, the Scooby-Doo sort of thing. You definitely get the drug scene. Same sort of drugs as what we're talking about previously with the 60s, but there's less of them of the uptightness and a little bit more relaxed and a bit more of yeah, just relaxing, taking time. Let's chill out. Let's enjoy the moment rather than let's grab a quick drink and cup of tea and run to the office. Rock is really flourishing at this point, and it's a raw sense of rock as well, very raw. And really, you can sing a lot about a lot of things. There's a lot more lyricists which are emerging, which are telling more truths. There's a lot of creativity which is occurring in the 1970s, but I don't think the economy was getting that great during the 1970s, particularly coming up to the late 70s as well. So we do get that sign of a little bit of friction. Again, yeah, we're talking about the immense amount of colours from the 70s, the fashion, especially women's fashion. You've got to think of the women's fashion as well. Men's fashion doesn't. Obviously, you got the jeans seem to be defining during men's fashion, and obviously there's certain light shirts which come in. But for women, there's a big flourish of different clothes that occur. So yeah, there's lots of defining things, more than I can even probably mention for the 70s. And now we come into my birthing decade, which is intensely interesting. So we have the 1980s. Now I think 1980s has a lot of sort of what's the way to describe it? There's a lot of material, a lot of media. There's a lot of movies. There's a lot of music which is being generated during the 1980s, which is very interesting. You have, I think, probably one of the major sort of things that you might need to mention at this point is MTV culture. Probably it did occur in the late 1970s, but even so. You have imagery and music coming in as one, more so than ever more. So these rock stars would be taken to an even higher level, and because of the amount of sheer money that's involved in this machine, you've got CDs which are coming on board, and things are getting a lot more compact and accessible. Music's and there's a lot of money to be generated from these arenas. So a hell of a lot of creative input is going into this era. Some people might just hate this 80s music anyway, but regardless of that fact, you're getting a high amount of production quality, which is going into 80s sounds. There's a lot of obviously there's a technology sort of era as well. So computers start to emerge at that point, and there's this ideal of the future which is occurring all the time, where everyone's thinking about the future and what computers are going to hold for us in the future. So we're getting this sort of futuristic sort of look. There's no shame of people putting blue colours on their faces. There's computer generated music as well, which hadn't been used before. Everything was more of the raw sounds. Now we're getting synthesized sounds which are occurring. So it's how that technology is overlapping with the 80s. Then What else are we getting from the 80s? So the movies, I think the movies, obviously, you're getting a lot of the movies which are occurring there. I know that Star Wars happened in the late 1970s, but I always say that the 80s really kicked in during like 78 and then a little bit onwards. That's how the decade probably could be defined a little bit better. Yeah, so yeah, we're getting all of those interesting layers, and the movies are very defining. There's a lot of movies which are coming out, which still to this day are being rerun because of the immense amount of profitability. It's I guess like the real movie culture is happening at this stage. There's I think probably the profits that have been generated in the movies industry around the 1980s went into overdrive, and we're really definitely seeing like an immense amount of creativity which is coming out in the 1980s. I know obviously people do say that there's certain areas that have better movies and things like that, but just for a spectacle and how really you could do anything in the 80s now. You could have spaceships, you could have wars, you could have aliens, and I know that a lot of those things could happen in like the 1950s era, and but you're really getting it to a very polished state, and it's looking really good. What else do we have? Yeah, we can't deny obviously I just mentioned about computer music, but obviously computers are coming onto the scene. It's interesting how everyone thinks that the computers are going to take over like work and take over the world and stuff like that. And almost like if you look at the 80s and the early 80s, we think that this artificial technology is going to emerge and like power us beyond all known realms, which is an interesting perspective. But obviously, it's still 2015, and not really. I mean, it's done some things, but we're still taking out the garbage, and we're still living our lives pretty much, with the exception of the internet, pretty much as normal as what it was like in the 1980s. There is obviously a lot of distinctions, particularly in the internet, but beyond that, we still have birthday parties, we still have drive the kids to school, all those kind of normal menial things that happen. Yeah, so the 80s does, there's many more points of the 80s which I think there's toys, there's an immense amount of toys which occur. You're talking about action figures. I know that you had plenty of action figures in the past, but toys seem to be very poignant at that time. You're thinking about the Star Wars minifigures and He-Man. Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff in that respect. And then I could talk about the 80s forevermore. There's plenty more that I know that I'm not even just scraping the marker off. So we also with the 80s, what are we talking about? We're talking about cubism, talking about Rubik's cubes. We're still looking at a lot of colours which are emerging, a lot of more silvers and things that you would like sort of describe with computers. You look at computer text as well. That will be like the way you describe the 1980s. But yeah, there's literally tons of stuff from the 80s which is emerging, and there is a lot of creative talent there, which I believe which is coming out in that era. Then we get to the 90s. Now, back to the 80s actually briefly. We're going to think about the booming time. So there was a big boom in the 80s in the financial sectors and financial industry. So you got a little boom point which is occurring in the 80s. I know there's obviously some pullbacks, particularly towards the end of the 80s. But you got to see how that creative expansion occurs with the what's the word? well, just creative expansion with the economy booming. So now we approach the 90s, and the 90s. I think the 90s. Like I remember always going, because I'm obviously a kid in the 90s now, and I'm now really experiencing the 90s. There's a certain little connection which occurs between one decade to another. Maybe because the parents lived in that a certain decade, and then they try and give that sort of decade back to their children. So there's a connection between the 80s and the 50s. 90s and 70s, there seems to be that connection, and yeah, that's the only thing I can think of, because there was little bits of throwbacks of certain clothes that we wore in the 90s. I remember there being high boots and colourful shirts. I remember there was obviously the shirt that you could handprint on, and it had these heat reactors, chemical things on them, so that was like an interesting sort of thing that occurred. There was still that sort of colour element which was occurring in the 90s. I remember there was a lot of fluorescent colours, maybe pales and fluorescents. So you get a pale white and a fluorescent green, which would be occurring. This still is an era, the early 90s. If you got to think about it in this respect, early 90s, still Michael Jackson is very popular. You can't. So I mentioned Elvis. You got to think about these big artists around that time. Michael Jackson's still fairly popular. I know he's probably released about Dangerous, I think, which was my first ever CD as well. So I remember that. Yeah, it's just very very interesting in the realms of music, because I remember the music was there's a lot of rerun songs, a lot of songs that have been repeated before, always, but just rejingled again. So there wasn't many songs you thought, oh, that's really defining my sound, and that's the sound of the 90s. But when you look back now, there was definitely a sound to the 90s. Which is interesting, and a lot of them were sort of very catchy sort of songs. They weren't too serious. There was the emergence of dance music to a certain degree. The drugs of the 90s is a lot more defining, especially for British culture. You have the definition of dance culture and ecstasy, so that's potentially having an influence on dance music at that point. What else is happening in the 90s? You do have the Britpop era. You have the grunge era in America, and there are certain countercultures which are occurring. So it's interesting how there's an even more of a pushback against your parents about this little ideal world which we might have had in the 1950s with the white picket fence, and now it's getting pushed back even harder with how depressed I'm feeling, and me screaming back at the world that I'm living in, and how there's no hope, and there's no getting out of this absolute trap that I'm living in, and I hate school and all those things. So there's a definite truth and a realism which is occurring. There's the indie band movement in Britain, which is always interesting in that respect. How we can, how British artists seem to bring out their own sort of color in the music industry. So yeah, there's still a lot happening, especially in the music scene, which is occurring at that stage. I guess it's sort of reinventing itself in the 90s as well. There's obviously it's gone through this massive explosion from the 80s, and now it's trying to find its way again from scratch. And there's a lot of things which are kicking in all different directions. So yeah, interesting. So now, not to mention, obviously, we got the start of I'm not mentioning too much in the way of R&B as well. R&B's and that kind of music is really getting really popular, and that's going to kick in massively in the turn of the millennium. So yeah, turn of the millennium. Now here we are. Now I'm just going to try and scratch if I can try and define certain things which are kicking in. turn of the millennium. Now we this is the age of the internet. We're really using the internet at this point. Um, Certain things are coming on board now. Obviously, things are coming on a little bit later than others, but so you do get that's a little bit of a little what's the word? Blink 182. So for music, Blink 182. I'm thinking about some 24, 40. I can't remember what the band was. Bare Naked Ladies. I guess some of that's a little bit 90s-ish as well, but I'm still thinking about that kind of music around that time. Also, I'm thinking about like Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg. I'm thinking about that, so which really they do take over the dance floor music more so than anywhere else. So that's a big deal in the music industry. But at this point as well, we're really getting stuck into genres. I can't. This may be one of the reasons why I'm not able to define eras that much, is because people can now really listen to exactly the genre they want to. They can listen to death metal. They can listen to classical music. They can really just go into their own certain genre of music, and there isn't this collective appreciation of a certain sect of music. And there are some things which are more popular than others, and some things which are hitting the dance floor a bit more than other songs as well. But the problem when we get past the millennium is that everyone can listen to what the hell they want now. There's not this mainstream thing, which there's not all these record industries which are pulling out this sort of song, which or this sound, which is everyone's trying to get involved in. Everyone's able to do their things more and more, and as we get into the teens of 2000s, then yeah, it's even getting pushed out more wider in that respect. So the age of music, I'm really it does get a little bit more, because each one of the genres of music is getting stronger in their own sort of right. You've got the R&B thing, which I think maybe you could probably say is more the most commercially successful sort of genre of music. But then dance music, they might go a little bit underground. I know it's re-emerged, and it's a lot of it's very commercially sort of stuff, but especially this my love is is like a little bit of an 80s twist with like a French house synthy sort of sound. I love like the Alex Brax and Daft Punk sound as well. So that's the era of that really sort of that kind of music really punched in and emerged for me. But also I love the indie scene as well, the early 2000s, and you think about the Libertines, things like that. That really was an expansion on that side, and you got lots from the American side on the indie scene as well. So you're getting this massive scrambling of all these different genres of music. I remember obviously all my CD collection occurred in like the early 2000s, and a little bit leading up to the end of it as well. And I remember there was lots of interesting different parts of music which were coming out, and that all those different little levels of interesting music are just getting more into their own little channels, further and further, and you're getting no mainstream really. I guess it seems like today we're getting mainstream dance music, which it's not really my cup of tea too much. But it's really hard to define it. And I guess maybe dance music, where you get the big load of people in a field, you can see that popular sort of ideal in that respect, and maybe it's a bit more commercially viable than other things. But I guess maybe this is why there is a big struggle in the music industry. I know obviously since ever since probably Napster and that point onwards, the music industries and like the record companies have been decimated. And maybe the only way that real monetization of music can occur is through selling of concerts and going live, compared to where you would be just you could release an album, sit back and live off the royalties. So not only was it just the case where you could just make a top-selling album and sit back and enjoy, that industry has really changed. People now can access all music from their fingertips straight away. There wasn't even the case where you would have to go down the road, maybe get on a bus, go down to the record shop, and then speak to the record shop owner there. Say you like this person. Have you got anybody that's like that? And then that person might just say, okay, well maybe you might like this person, or you've got somebody through a friend who tells you, oh, this song's really good. And there's obviously a chart hits as well, which come in as well. Whereas nowadays you can listen to anything you like, and you can go to any genre, and there's just a massive expansion of everything. And obviously kids nowadays can just go onto YouTube and listen to any of their artists. They've got the full music video. That's basically the replaced MTV. You get the advert from there, so artists do make a little bit of a royalty fee back in terms of the adverts which are being put on YouTube. But it's really interesting how definition is really hard to ground in, but maybe it is because everyone can listen to whatever the hell they want to, and it's not really there isn't as big as a mainstream anymore as what there used to be. Yeah, it's interesting though how some of the manufactured sort of bands can still exist, but their strength was the concert. So your Justin Bieber's and there's loads of girl artists out there. I can't even think of one. How shameful. But yeah, there's. Why am I keep on thinking about Shania Twain? It's the other one. It's another country girl. I can't remember. Correct me. So yeah, there's the concert model artist, but the one that's highly commercial is still surviving and thriving in this arena. So it's interesting how they are still alive. So anybody who's got a big concert model what's a band or single singer and stuff like that, you've really you can print money in that respect, but obviously it's very tricky just to work through it and become very popular over time. It's yeah, you could say in terms of your typical band, it's a bit of a quiet time for your bands. There definitely are a lot of good bands out there, and I've listened to so many that are still coming out today and bringing out really good songs, which I think could become mainstream. But they're really not emerging and not coming through as much as what they did in the past. So yeah, and obviously there's a little bit of computer music and a little bit of a twist with bands, and that's always going to emerge between the two of those. And how obviously dance music's root is in computers, but there is just bands which can cross over with the music as well. So yeah, interesting definition points I'm making. Well, it might be your choice whether I'm making interesting points or not, but yeah, if you can make any other ones which can blend beautifully in with mine, I would very much appreciate it. What else? Movies. Now there are some brilliant movies. But for some reason I always go into a blank when I start to think about recent movies that I've watched, which are any good. Movies nowadays are hyper polished, hyper real, 3D. Okay, maybe we'll mention Avatar and might mention Batman reruns, which were 80s films as well, and I think just as popular as the past. But obviously, I think we've got the real polished aspect of that. Great, we have just got a broken windscreen, which is amazing. It's so annoying. Hopefully that windscreen crack's not going to go any further. Alright. What's next? So annoying. Why did I drive today and get that windscreen crack? Let's get past it. Anyway. Yeah, so we have the movies. There's some brilliant movies which are occurring in this time. I'm sort of more focused on the dramas now rather than the big action spectaculars. But it's really tricky to start defining moments of anything past the millennium. Really struggling in that respect. So what else? We're talking about ages now. Obviously, now since we got to 2007, which is probably you might be able to say that there was a boom time, and there probably was a boom time, but it didn't really feel like a boom time. More so, probably in the property market for more the people that are a bit more on the age side of things. But maybe not for the young. The young's always felt a little bit pushed outside of society in terms of being able to afford a house. But there definitely was boom times for the older generations, being able to sell property, go for something bigger, renovate it. And this is obviously I'm always talking from a Western perspective, but we can also mention that India and China has had this massive emergence from being extremely poor countries to having a fairly far more of a bigger economy. I guess there's the high rich people which have emerged, and there's a bigger pull-out of poverty from the general masses. So there's a big emergence there in that respect. So it's moving back onto the West as well. So 2007 probably is the defining point, and where we have had all this credit expansion, and if we're in the 80s, born a little bit past anything from 82 onwards, I would say you probably didn't quite get onto the property market at the right time. Maybe you did. But yeah, it hadn't really seemed like we were super wealthy, but the older generation were. And then the shit hit the fan in 2007, and it's really just been plodding along, but things gradually seem to just be, okay, it's getting a little bit better. But the news says it's getting better, but it doesn't really seem that great for everywhere else, and there isn't that much good news, and people like to put their heads in the sand, and job hunting just becomes this long wait and this long hunt for a long extended periods of time where people get quite worried. But then when you do get a job, you don't necessarily leave it. So yeah, there's this little definition which occurs straight after 2007 onwards, which I think is going to continue for quite some time unless some big changes happen. And yeah, we don't really have this definition because our music has expanded into many directions. Movies seem to still crack it, but they seem to do a lot of repeats of past movies, which generally happened in the 80s. And there's high production standards, but it's again as we're getting more sort of into probably the market wants more bespoke and more specialized movies to be generated. It's not quite coming out so far, and maybe the model for the movie industry is still going to have a massive change at some point. I've heard a lot of things in the past where at some point we are going to find that the movie industry is going to put out a massive blockbuster and find out that it's going to turn into Waterworld, and then people are going to be rather the movie industry is going to go through a big recession period. But there's still like everybody can grab a camera nowadays. Probably not going to get the best, highest polished quality of movie, but there's still the realms that you can generate into every single genre that you could possibly imagine, and people do want more of the personalized type of movie which can relate to them more so and more so. So yeah, maybe that's one of the major factors as to why we're not really getting a definition of our times, and why I find it a little bit hard to mark the times. Definitely clothes wise, I'm not really seeing anything. Maybe skinny jeans, little Buddy Holly glasses. Maybe that's sort of a little bit of like the trendy types, if I can define that at all. But really, I'm really struggling in terms of clothes. Maybe it's because I'm getting into the age where I'm a bit more so of a parent, and I'm not able to get down with the kids as much. But yeah, I mean, again, maybe the fashion as well is just anything goes, and any era or any genre is going. I've seen all different parties occur from which are meant to be from all different decades. So anything goes nowadays, and it really the definition standard of times are going into a blur, and it might be because of mass globalization, and there is an isolation which is occurring as much more, where that you could have a big sort of genre or a movement which would occur. It's not quite so happening anymore because we're splitting up into our own little micro factions. It's like you might be splitting up into your little. I might be part of the philosophy faction, and everyone's going into like different idea spaces, which people find their best relation to and defining themselves as well. So, all right, maybe this is that's maybe like how we can define it as this is the decades where anything goes, and we're specializing, and this is the point where everything gets rubbed out, and there isn't really anything that you could potentially define us on. Could I be right? I don't know. It's really interesting. You can't scratch out the internet. The internet has obviously revolutionized us. Oh, you could. There's a couple of things actually, which mobile devices. Mobile devices are obviously kicked in. The iPhone, obviously, Apple has really branded decades. I think more so than anywhere else. If you think about the text and the grey schemes and how everything's simplicity and the writing, I think that definitely can define us a little bit in terms of how we define our time. And obviously, if you could think of all of the biggest products and the biggest brands, this is the era or the decade of Apple, more so than any other brand, you would say. So maybe that's one of the gadgets, or it's definitely it's the coolest item to have around is the latest iPhone. So maybe we've got something in terms of defining us there. What else? What else do we have? What do we have? But yeah, I think people, when they're going to look back at our time, how would they perceive these decades? I think they're going to say, okay, the internet. They're going to say iPhones and how we're connected through the social media, and this is the time where we become more virtual beings in the terms of how we structure things, and there'll be a definite intensive interest in this time because we're coming through the age of where we used to like meet people at certain points in time in the day, and we never used to have had home telephones, but not too much. Not too much like quick communication as what we do now, and we're really sort of this is the first time where we're really like flexing our muscle on the social media sphere. I know I'm a little bit late on the podcasting arena, but I guess that era is still kicking in. I think I guess another one as well is that people can multitask a lot more now. People can listen to me dribble onto you, and then you can still do your mowing in the garden, and you can do a job, or you can do anything you want to at the same time, and expand your mind while doing a fairly menial task. So I don't know whether that's anything to do with anything. I guess there's a lot of instant gratification from occurring just using these devices all the time, and there's a lot of, obviously, people can hide and go away in these devices. Obviously, another one. Okay, we can't distract ourselves from this, but pornography is easily accessible in this this age. So there's definitely something happening in terms of society in that realm. Maybe more liberalisation, maybe there's a little bit more of a pullback in terms of how people are more obsessive with instant gratification. Who knows? There's little counter things and counterbalances which might be occurring from easy gratification information, which can pleasure you in the moment, but doesn't necessarily give you a brilliant long-term, fully fully rounded ideas to make you very productive and create plenty of value in the future. So yeah, this is a lot to think about. I do hope you've enjoyed the show. If there's any other ideas which you can mention, especially when it comes to defining the decade we're in and the decade before us, I find it very hard in itself just to split hairs between the two of those. Anyway, maybe when we look back and you listen to this podcast, you might find it interesting in terms of how I see it from my perspective. But yeah, it's been an interesting little thought experiment. If you can throw in some more ideas onto the table, or just send me an email, or put a message or comment in on my WordPress or on my YouTube channel, I will very much appreciate that. And let's keep the ideas flowing. Particularly when it comes to why I can't define the decade, and how if you could try and define the decade we're in and the last decade, how would they be defined? Yeah, thank you very much for your time. I have to get my windscreen fixed, which is a beautiful pleasure. Just goes to show that when you're living in the real world and you're not living in the virtual world, you've got to deal with these day-to-day struggles. Thank you very much for your time as always. And remember, this decade is still not defined, and you could be the one who defines it. So I'll leave you with those thoughts. Thank you very much, and we'll speak soon. Bye-bye.